Hello and welcome to another Canguroenglish Daily Digest. My name is Christian and today is Thursday. Best day of the week. Today we are going to go back to the future, which means that the things that I'm going to talk about today actually relate to some of the things that I've been talking about over the past 3 daily digests this week. So, I'm trying to tell a sort of a longer term narrative about, about language and learning and so, yeah. So let's start with today's word of the day. Today's word of the day is grit. Yeah, grit. And this comes from a Germanic origin. Groat, which basically meant crushed stones. So crushed stones produces a kind of like like a hard sand. It's not really like sand. It's more, it's harder than sand, stronger than sand. It's the stuff that you can make roads out of, or the stuff you can make concrete out of, right? It's grit. So grit has various different meanings, but in general, grit, apart from the actual physical substance of like this hard sand, this crushed stone, apart from that, grit is used in a lot of metaphorical ways. So grit can refer to something which is kind of dirty and rough and maybe a bit kind of real, a bit urban. So, and this goes back to the way that we form adjectives in English by adding the Y. So you could describe a film as gritty. It's a gritty movie. It's kind of a bit rough and dirty and hard. So maybe you could say that, a film about boxing is kind of gritty. It's kind of, dark and lots of intense, light and shadow, chiaro scuro. Or you could say that maybe you're reading a novel which is kind of gritty, about like, dirty, hard kind of suburbs like Chicago. Yeah. It's my Chicago gangster accent. Yeah, so gritty. And another metaphorical use is you could say, if you want to succeed at learning English, you need grit. Grit is like, you need to be hard, you need to be tough, you need to be strong. And there's actually a set phrase in English which is true grit. None of that fake, that fake imported Chinese grit. No, you need true grit if you want to succeed at learning a language, because you have to do it for a long time. So there's another one, and again, to take us back to something that we talked about just recently in a couple of podcasts, we have a version of grit, this word grit, which we use with reduplication. With reduplication. You remember reduplication when we talked about higgledy-piggledy? Well, there's something called nitty-gritty. Okay, so nitty-gritty is more about the size, right? So remember that reduplication can make things seem kind of like smaller, like more childish, more like for babies. So nitty-gritty is the fine details of something. So imagine you have to write a technical paper. Here's your technical paper, and you say, well, I've done my first draft, but now I really need to get into the nitty-gritty. The small little details. So this reminds us about how beautiful and flexible language can be when we talk about making adjectives and using reduplication and metaphor, because I'm a little bit obsessed with metaphor at the moment. And that leads me on to the next thing I want to talk about which is sort of about metaphor, but it's actually about gesture. Gesture. You know, there's that famous joke, how do you stop an Italian from speaking? Well, if you want to stop an Italian from speaking, you tie their hands behind their back. Because they can't, they can't speak without all of this, right? But you'll notice that I use my hands a lot. I'm doing it right now, in fact. I use it for simple things like pointing, right? Or maybe indicating a movement. And maybe you think that my use of gestures is maybe excessive or not. Maybe you think I don't use gestures that much. Depends on your cultural context a little bit. But you will be amazed at how important gesture is to language learning. So, not this paper, but there was a paper which I did not print, which is slightly relevant, called Gestures and Words During the Transition to Two-Word Speech by Olga Kapirci, Jana Everson, and Virginia Volterra. And what this paper shows is that children children when they're learning to speak, they have various phases, right? So the first phase is babbling. They're like, blah, 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 right? And then they transition to one word, like for example, not scissors, food, mummy, park, out, doggy, right? One word. And then they're going to transition to two words to kind of connect, want food, go out, kiss mummy, for example. Okay, there's a transition to two words. But before they transition from one word to two word, they transition from one word to gesture. They go out, out, food, doggy. And this again, because remember we're going back to the future, this goes back to what I was talking about yesterday, I think yesterday, yes, about how when children are learning which pronunciation sounds to eliminate or not eliminate in when they're learning a language, right? They're creating in their brains these motor pathways. Good morning, Jose. How are you?
Hey, good morning. I was silence.
My collaborator, Jose. So children are learning to speak, and they're remembering those particular pronunciation sounds, and they're creating motor pathways for the pronunciation. So, for example, in the Japanese children, they're learning to do the l, but they're not learning to do the So this physical motor pathway disappears in the brain, and gesture has a similar effect, right? When you say doggy, doggy, this gesture, or out, or food, this gesture is a motor pathway in the brain, the same as the mouth, right? And this is what's really interesting. The effect of gestures on second language memorization by young children. Ooh. Okay, so this is what they did. They had three groups. One group, let me go back a little bit. So there was a group of 5-year-old children. So then they had three groups of 5-year-olds. The first group, they taught them 5 vocabulary words. 5 words on a TV screen. The next group, they taught them 5 vocabulary words with pictures. The third group, they taught them 5 vocabulary words with gestures. For example, snake, book, and rabbit. And guess what? The children that learned the vocabulary with gestures, here's the data, gestures, they remembered 1 extra word in their long-term active vocabulary out of 5 words. It's an incredible difference. So incorporate gestures into your language learning. I hope you enjoyed this daily digest. I'll see you in class.